John, how are you doing? You've been on the road. You've been doing this for a while,
I
and
know.
you. It looks like you kind of know what the field finally looks like.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would be really surprised if anyone else jumped in at this point, except for maybe Corey Lewandowski now that he's unemployed. But that's not on our side. On the other side, because actually somebody said the other day that Kelly Ayotte actually hasn't announced that she's running again. Um, which
Huh.
I was like, huh, I guess that might be true. So yeah, I'm happy to finally know, the lay of the land for the primary. I think that it sets us up in a good position. Honestly, it doesn't really change all that much for me, except that now we know kind of who we're running against. I think, I've been trying to tell people this because it sort of is hard with the messaging, but given the proximity of the primary and the general election, you really have to run both races at the same time. You have to be running, trying to win Democrats, but trying to win the independent voters who aren't going to be voting in the primary. And I find that to be, frankly, one of the hardest parts about New Hampshire governor's race is just these two dates, September and November, so close together. And sometimes when I'm messaging to the independents, the Democrats go, "Hey, wait, what are you saying there? You're not talking to us." And then when I talk to the Democrats, some of the independent voters go, "Hey, I'm not quite understanding that message," and and that is honestly probably the biggest obstacle right now. I mean, there's many, but that's definitely one of them I've run into.
And it does look like for a little while last year, the legislature was talking about accelerating changes to that primary calendar into the 2026 cycle, which would have been rather abrupt, given
Yeah,
that it was the 2026 cycle already, and
yeah,
eventually decided, I guess, 2028 is when we're looking at what we call it, early summer rather than early fall primary.
yeah. That would be great. Yeah,
I support that. It was
100%.
interesting. That was one of those bills that had unusual, unpredictable coalitions both for and against it. So I would have spirited debates with Democratic friends who were against the change and surprising agreement with folks that I'm not sure I agree what day of the week it is on a lot of stuff. But on this one, I mean, and I will say, having run for governor and managed governor's races, I agree with what you said a moment ago that especially when you're not the incumbent and you're
Yeah,
trying to build name ID with two, frankly, pretty different audiences. This low engagement, I'm sorry, very high engagement, but relatively small group of generally fairly partisan, often hyper partisan Democrats or Republicans. And then this very broad, much lower level of engagement, general electorate. Maybe there's some overlap on the issues, and I think in this election there probably is. But
yeah.
it's very hard. Those are two different jobs that you're forced to kind of build the plane and fly the plane at the same time. Hard if you're not the incumbent, right? I mean, you ran in 24. I mean, what do you find to be the biggest difference on a mechanical, practical level between 24 and your efforts so far in the 26 cycle?
I think the biggest thing is I've gotten my stump speech down to like 3 minutes, and I'm sticking to three talking points: housing, property taxes, education funding. I'm calling it community first economics, which kind of ties a bow around the whole thing. And really just trying to be concise and repetitive with the message. I mean, I go to some of these meetings and I'll try to say, property taxes, housing, education funding, one issue. And I say that three or four, even five times in the same speech, just because I'm like, I got to get these three ideas locked in, and they got to leave here knowing something about me, especially if there's going to be a couple other speakers from CD1 or whatever. And I've had people tell me, they're like, quite a bit tighter this time, Kuiper, so that's been really helpful. I think just knowing the lay of the land a little bit more, being more comfortable, chatting about all these topics is super helpful. I watched a video from my very first, beginning of my very first, last run, and it was just funny because I just looked like, I mean, it's like a year or whatever, 2 years ago, I felt like a child compared to where I'm at right now. So, it's definitely, one of those things. I mean, I'm sure, having done it twice, the second time, it's like, all right, This is not my first rodeo. I sort of understand what's going on here. There's still some aspects of it that I don't know that I will ever fully, you know, be good at, like making calls and fundraising. Is never going to be, I think, something I'm great at. I've been trying to find as many alternative ways of raising money as possible. But I'm also kind of getting more comfortable making the calls, and we've gotten more donations that way than we did last time, and it hasn't even really been as long. So definitely a lot more comfortable this time for sure.
So you mentioned the community-based or community-first economics. I've seen you on social media, I believe, holding up a copy of the book. Okay, I figured this was coming. So let's take a minute. And I know when we were preparing, going back and forth to prepare, you had mentioned that, and as part of this, I'm sure, you want to talk some about education funding, the way we do it, perhaps the way we distribute it as well. But maybe step back first. Why the book? You had plenty going on, or maybe this is sort of a centerpiece of the campaign. So
Yeah,
talk about the book.
it really is. I started writing a book right after the last election that was kind of a combination of like the drama of the campaign trail, but it was also like policy stuff about, New Hampshire housing, taxes, whatever. And it just felt like two different books. And I was maybe 150 pages in. I was like, this seems like two different books. So I took the policy half, then kind of combined other notes and stuff that I'd done, research that I had from the last campaign, and just combined it into sort of one big, or not even big, it's only 150 pages. But one book. It basically spells out how trickle-down economics really destroyed the middle class, exacerbated inequality, and has led us to the situation that we're in right now where, I think this is important for people to understand. Trump didn't cause inequality. Trump was a symptom of inequality. And until we tackle inequality and have politicians recognize like this disparity between how much money the lowest people have or the lower income people have and the higher income people have is tearing society apart. And it's historically, this is what happened in Rome. It's what happened in France. It's what happened in the US in 1929, which led to the New Deal and FDR. So historically, people really got to understand that when I say something like tax the rich, that's actually like a pro-rich statement. That's trying to bring stability to the system and saying like, since my lifetime, 1980, since Reagan was in there, we've just been cutting taxes for the wealthy, cutting taxes for corporations, and it's just wiped out Main Street. It's hurt, businesses. It hurt my business. I just watched a slow erosion of my sort of community, and the book starts out with a story about this guy that we nicknamed the Big Kahuna. And he came in one day, asked for this crazy burger with a fried egg and pulled pork on top of it. And the thing was, he would only come in maybe once a month. And around Christmas, he started coming in like 2 or 3 times a week. And so one day I said to him, hey, why are you coming in? How come you're in here all the time now? And he said, I work at Best Buy and they give me 20 hours a week. Around Christmas, they bump up my hours to overtime because they don't want to pay me benefits. Right. But he was like, if I got paid more, I would eat here more. And I mean, it seems like a really stupid, simple statement, but this light bulb went off in my head where I was like, this is the economy. If this guy's getting paid $9 an hour, this was before the pandemic, so I'm sure they're making more now. But if this guy's getting more than $9 an hour and 20 hours a week, he's in my restaurant 3 times a week and not once. And just seeing the economy from the ground level. I have this shop across the street, and it's been empty. It's one of those shops that's constantly turning over. Yeah. It was a vintage shop, and then a hair salon, and then a tattoo shop. And I would notice, like when the tattoo shop was there, if they were busy, they'd come over and have lunch. If it was a slower day, they wouldn't. If the business that was in there, like right now it's a barber shop, those guys are in, every day because they're busy and they're making money. And I just started to see in a real, like, practical but simple way that having money funnel up to the wealthy billionaires is just not good for the economy. And so that's basically what Community First Economics is about. It's about reframing the way that we think about the government and the economy to work for the community as opposed to a corporation.
I remember back when George W. Bush was president, early in his administration, I believe the first tax cut was actually before 9/11. And so he got a lot of attention. It was a different time, obviously. And he was asked, why do you want to cut taxes in the specific plan that he had? It was the biggest tax cut in American history at the time. And he said, look, it's fair. If you pay taxes, you get a tax cut. But he missed a key word in there in his plan. If you paid income taxes, you got an income tax cut, a federal income tax cut. But the way the system was set up, 3/4 of Americans, working age Americans, were paying more in payroll tax than they were paying in income tax. And of course, he didn't do anything with the payroll tax rate, like
Yeah.
say raise the taxable amount and maybe lower the rate to make it a little more progressive,
Yeah.
tax rate. And so most Americans were not actually paying a ton of federal income tax. They were all paying federal payroll tax. And I mean, as somebody who's run a business, and myself, I'm self-employed. It's when you're paying both sides of the payroll tax. If you're paying that on $1,
Yeah.
and in a later time they did cut the payroll tax a little bit. I believe in the Great Recession, they cut the payroll tax rate for a year as a stimulus package,
Yeah. I
and we
remember
saw a
that.
tremendous increase in spending because, to your point, if somebody's making 33 grand a year and they get an extra $300 to $500 back in their pocket, you can guarantee that $500 is going to get spent.
Yeah.
Probably places like the restaurant you had or the barbershop across or something. It's where it's getting spent.
Yeah.
That's when we talk about priming the pump instead of the trickle down. I mean, you see at the federal level, and it seems, and maybe this is a bit of a segue. I see some questions already here that get at okay, here's a question. If you
Yeah.
were to win, would you reinstate the interest and dividends tax on the wealthiest residents and raise the BET, which has been cut several times? There's a bill to cut that rate again. Folks may not know what the BET is. We can get into that in a second. It's a corporate, uh, it's a business tax. Um, where are you as you look at this from a state level in terms of finding additional revenue, specifically the interest and dividends, state level tax, and some of the business taxes whose rates have been cut multiple times over the past decade or so? Where do you see that fitting in?
Yeah, I am a big proponent of both bringing back the interest and dividends tax and also raising the BET, business enterprise tax, up to, the rates it was at in the early 2000s. Still you could raise it at least a half and maybe at least 0.75% and still be below all the states around us. So, and the interest and dividends tax was a great wealth tax. It really was. I mean, the majority of people paying that were millionaires. It was instated in 1923. And we really need that revenue. I mean, it was 187 million, I think, projected the last year before it was phased out. And when I talk to people, particularly, and this is something I've heard from people that call themselves conservative Republicans, is they were in favor of the interest and dividend tax. They were okay with that one coming back, probably because they weren't paying it. Another interesting fact about that, I've got a friend who's a financial advisor, and he was telling me that when that tax was finally cut, some of his clients were seeing more money in their monthly checks, their annuities or whatever, and they were like, "Oh, why did I suddenly get more money?" And they just had no idea that they were even paying the interest and dividends tax. So I think that's important for people to know. Also, when you cut the BET by 0.5% or whatever they're trying to do right now, it's not really a meaningful benefit for the majority of businesses out there. That the majority of small businesses are not going to see any benefit from that. They're not going to be able to hire a new employee or expand their operation in any way. And it just means on the aggregate, it's tens of millions of dollars that we're losing. And over the decades, hundreds of millions of dollars that we've lost. So I think that's what's a really important part to understand, is that it's the cumulative effect, over 10 years of all these reductions in taxes. Take the rooms and meals tax. When I first started my business in 2015, it was 8.5%, or sorry, 9%. They maybe it started at 9, I think, and then went down to 8.5. Yeah. And
I
at
think that's right.
a 0.5% deduction, it didn't. I mean, that for my little restaurant, that was maybe a couple $1,000s a year. Now, if you had 20 McDonald's, it would probably be a substantial amount of money. But it wasn't an amount of money that would be really boosting the economy in any meaningful way. And it's just killing our state revenue and killing, the amount of money we have to help our municipalities. I think that's an important thing for people to understand too, that it might not be, it's sort of sometimes hard to draw a direct line between your property taxes going up and tax cuts in Concord, because it's not exactly a one for one. But it just means there's less money in the kitty for everything. There's less money for grants for wastewater treatment plants, or for, sidewalk infrastructure, or whatever different, ways that the state, in good times can help out towns and cities with their various infrastructure costs. I think it's also important for people to realize that Sununu was able to operate under millions, and probably billions of COVID money that papered over all of the financial problems in our state for the last 6 years. Basically, we're still running off the last fumes of that money. And so, I mean, in some ways, I feel like Kelly Ayotte kind of got the hot potato. It's just a matter of time until somebody was stuck holding the bag when the train ran out of tracks, when we've kicked the can down the line for so long that there's no amount of budget cutting that a town can do right now that's not going to be physically hurting, the school, like less teachers, less firefighters, less police, like literally hurting the infrastructure. I mean, there's just no fat left on these budgets. And I think that's where we're at. I mean, some of these towns and cities are having to make really hard calls about teachers and the municipal financing. And it's just brutal.
Well, at the local level, and this, you've been a local elected official in Newmarket. One of the challenges we see, it remains and will always be a relatively labor-intensive form of a cost center, because most of what local government provides are services, not goods, right?
Yeah.
Most of the police department's budget is personnel. Fire department, overwhelmingly personnel. Education, obviously, it's overwhelmingly personnel. And so one of the places where, at the macroeconomic level, we've seen ways to try to bat down inflationary pressure on, for example, healthcare costs, is technology. And the problem is, you can do that with widgets, right? You can do that with consumer electronics. You cannot do that in a practical way with public safety. You cannot do that with education. I think there are some folks on the more libertarian conservative, the free state element, who are saying you can basically eliminate a lot of the personnel costs in education, simply eliminate the school, move people to homeschool, use online, Khan Academy sort of things.
Yeah.
And there are isolated circumstances where that may be the right call for the certain kid or to take the certain course. I hear that. That is clearly an exception rather than a rule. And it means I'm hearing, Concord, their local school department, they're in a real hole because healthcare costs jacked up. Portsmouth, multi-million-dollar this year. Healthcare costs jacking up with pretty short notice, above initial projections. So these cities are having to come up with several $1,000,000 with very little notice, at a time when, as you say, the spigot appears to be closing further at the state level. I know that some Republicans will say, here's a chart, we're giving more money than ever. Well, it ignores two things. One is it ignores the role of inflation. The charts are always in actual dollars, not inflation adjusted dollars. So that's not going up, and that in that sense. And the second part is, look forward. If you are a school board member or a city councilor on a board of selectmen, whatever, project out 5 years from now. In the current trajectory, do you feel more confident or less confident that whatever level of state funding you've been projecting up to now, do you think it's going to be more? Do you think it's going to be the same? What's the trajectory? It looks like you have to kind of plan. It might be less. And that means you got to start finding the money locally, which brings, as it always does, back to property taxes. Always.
Yeah. And I think that's where people got to really understand this, problem with housing, property taxes, and education being one issue, in the sense that, the planning board doesn't want to approve 20 starter homes for families because it's going to boost up the property taxes through the school budget. But likewise, if you don't have that house for the teacher's living expenses go up. They need to get paid more. Same with the police and firefighters. So it's like this cycle that you really can't get out of without tackling the issue of school funding. And I think that's where we're at. And I think that more people are starting to realize that the current system it's just not sustainable.
So, a question for you: a week ago, a little more than a week ago, there was a plan put out. Andy Valinsky and a group of other folks. Andy, probably the best known of the folks in there, that involved income tax and a statewide property tax that would, the way it was described, not be like the current one where if you raise more than the formula suggests you should get, and right now you get to keep it. So it's not really
Yeah.
statewide. It's labeled that it's collected locally, it's kept locally. The state is sort of just a label on it.
Yeah.
His would actually have a redistributive element. The biggest criticism, one of the biggest criticisms, and I had them on last week and we talked about it. How do you avoid a situation where 5 years from implementation, we don't have similarly high property taxes and, in this case, a 3% income tax? Because that is the fear, and I
Yeah.
hear it, and it's a legitimate fear, because if we did end up in that situation, then whether you're upper class, middle class, lower class economically, more tax, you're going to get hit to some extent. So what do you think of that? Obviously, it wasn't your plan. You didn't put it out, but you're running for governor. So folks are
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
ask, what do you think of that concern and what do you do about it?
Yeah. I think it's a valid concern, especially we have a lot of people in New Hampshire who are sort of tax refugees from Connecticut. And I've talked to a lot of these people over the years, and they all will tell you, we didn't have the income tax, and they brought it in, and it didn't lower any taxes, and the taxes just keep going up. So I think it's a fear that we have to address for sure. And I think that there's a way where we could, through legislation, say that the state is mandated to cover 70% of the school expenses, and the towns and cities are going to cover the other 30, something like that. But I think people got to understand that if the state is going to cover a much bigger chunk of the school budget, there's going to be a level of control that the communities are going to have to give up. I don't think I don't think it makes sense for the state to be giving more money and having less control or the same amount or no control. And not to say that they should micromanage the schools, but I think that, when we start talking about how big our school districts are and, do we need a curriculum coordinator for every school, or maybe could we have one for every district? Is there some economies of scale we could look at, to sort of say to the more conservative folks, like, all right, maybe there is some ways we could save money administratively by having a little bit more state management of just the admin costs, basically, and the admin in general. Um, and I think that is, we got to meet sort of people where they're at. And I think it's fair to say, if the state's paying for a bigger chunk of the school, and I think they should, that there's going to have to be some give and take between the school districts. A good example would be our town, Newmarket, was about 10 or so years ago. We built a new school, $36 million. It took us 10 years to get it through the voters. And we looked at all these options about joining Durham and joining Lee and Lee coming to us. And the whole process to me felt very like we were on our own. Like, it didn't feel like there was anyone from the state level saying, hey, maybe you and SAU 16 should talk. Or, there seemed to be like, it was just like, hey, the schools are a town problem and you figure it out. And what's kind of ironic is we built our school at much, great expense. We just ended up rehabbing the school we had. We didn't build a new school. And what's kind of ironic is Exeter High School is about, I don't know, maybe 5 miles as a crow flies, and they are 400 kids below their capacity. Newmarket High School is exactly 400 kids. And we have kids having to go to Epping and Portsmouth to play different sports because we don't have enough kids to have a football team or a cycling team. So I just kind of think maybe if back then someone had said, hey, let's look at the numbers here, and you guys should probably combine. Now, I know a lot of people in Newmarket, and my kids in Newmarket, public school right now. A lot of parents would say, "Hey, we don't want to send our kids to some other town. We like having our little town." Well, we've got to decide: do you want your property taxes to go down, or do you want to continue doing the same thing? And I think this is really the conversation that I really appreciate Andrew Volinsky and his guys bringing up is, we can't keep doing the same thing and expect something to change. We've got to start having this conversation. And I think, his plan is a great jumping off point. And from what I was reading, that seemed to be what their intention was like, hey, we're not even presenting this as legislation right now. We're just saying like, hey, this is a plan. You can like it or not like it, but if you don't like it, present your own plan. It's the Democrats have had since 2011 when SWEPT got basically more or less repealed. I mean, it still exists on paper, but it's not a statewide education property tax. They've had since 2011 to come up with a game plan, and there's not a ton of options. I think we know that, statewide property tax, statewide sales tax, statewide income tax. And, my opinion is it's a 2-year term for governor that I'm running for. So in my first term, I want to do the tax revenue that we talked about earlier, business taxes, interest and dividends, maybe a second home tax for people that live out of state. I'd love to see cannabis legalized and see a tax on that. And then ultimately, what I really want to do is have a conversation with this entire state through a series of forums where everyone can have a chance to say their piece, say what kind of tax they'd like to see, have all the numbers worked out so that you could know at $70,000 a year in Portsmouth in an apartment, how is my tax going to change under a sales, income, property tax, whatever. And Andrew started that with the calculator they has, which is great. I think that's really what the kind of stuff that people need to see on paper. Because what I don't want to do is the Democrats get a majority in 2026 or 2028. We put in, let's say Volinsky's plan, and then the voters reject it in 2032, and we're back to square one, like with the SWEPT. So I think it's imperative that we have the discussion. We give people the chance to say their piece, because I will tell you from talking to people in the state of New Hampshire, everyone's got an opinion on this. Almost no one thinks the current system is sustainable. And some people will say, oh, we need to cut some fat off the budget. Those people have not looked at a budget lately in the state. But if you talk to people, a lot of them will say, hey, I'm in favor of an income tax. I'm in favor of a sales tax. I want more of a value-added tax or a consumption tax. I mean, there's different ways we could cut this up. And I've had this conversation, not just with Democrats, but with Republicans, I had a libertarian who's called me up twice, diehard libertarian. He said, look, my friends and my friends would kill me for saying this, but my property taxes are so high, I'm ready to talk about an income tax or a sales tax. So I think the biggest part of this is just getting the conversation going, because it's going to take more than 2 years to implement whatever this bigger system is. And so that's where I'm kind of pushing what I think is like a safer first term position, which is like, we need more revenue because we're basically fiscally drowning right now. Let's get back to roughly the year 2000, what we were bringing in for revenue then, and we'll be not drowning, but we'll be just barely treading water. And then we can have this bigger discussion about how we're going to fund the schools in a more sustainable way. Another thing that I think people need to think about is AI and robots are going to put a lot of people out of work. And so in 10 years, is that going to be a sustainable, if we're taxing income or even sales for that matter, and 10% of the population has no jobs because they've been automated out of one, and now they can't pay income taxes. They got no money. They can't buy things to pay sales tax. So we got to really think. I would like to see a system that's going to last 50 years or whatever, a long-term plan that we got 60% of the population on board with, and something that we know is going to be acceptable by the average independent voter and even some conservative-leaning, Republicans.
A quick story related to the AI point you bring up a moment ago, which is not on the long-term horizon. It's on the doorstep for sure. So Chris Christie, he was running for president in what was that, the 2016 cycle, and he is doing events, and he starts hearing about addiction as the issue that kept popping up in his town halls, his Q&A. And at first it would be very episodic. And then it became a couple times. And then he noticed the crowd nodding. And this is about a decade, 10, 11 years ago, when by far the number one issue to most voters in New Hampshire was the scourge of addiction, the opiate addiction. So he, it starts getting a lot of attention. And something that Christie mentioned that I thought was very astute, he goes that people are acting like it just started, but what had just started was that upper middle class people in suburban communities like, Stratham or, Auburn or Bedford, their homes were the ones now that had a kid
Mhm.
that had fallen, into addiction, and in some cases, tragically, had even died. And suddenly, it was showing up at all the town hall meetings because he's like, before it was there. It's just that it was happening in lower income households who are the kind of folks that generally do not have the luxury of going to a town hall meeting at 4 o'clock at the Wyndham High School gymnasium. And
Yeah.
so you weren't hearing about it. All of a sudden, the New York Times reporters in the back of the room covering Chris Christie, and they're like, "Holy cow!" And now all of a sudden, now it's a big deal. It was a big deal. It's just that it took a certain strata.
Yeah.
They were the folks that knew to write a letter to the editor. They were the ones that would go to a town hall. They're the ones that knew somebody, and suddenly it was a big deal. I look at the AI. I remember when Andrew Yang was running for president in the 2020 cycle, he was talking about this more, as much or more than any of the candidates in that large field. And I heard him in an interview recently say that he was right about a lot of it, but he was wrong about one really important part of it, which brings me to your point about the AI. He thought that the first place that we'd see the major impact was blue collar working class jobs, but specifically truck drivers. And it turns out autonomous vehicles are moving, but not as fast as we would have guessed in 2019 in terms of mass acceptance. However, the where AI has accelerated greatly in the last few years is taking a lot of your entry level white collar jobs. These are the jobs that people paid for the college degree. It's entry level legal jobs, accounting jobs, engineering jobs. These are that pay pretty well, and that people got the debt from college. And they were
Yeah.
told, if you do this, you're going to be all set. And now all of a sudden, that is the first place that we're seeing real changes in the employment market, like 2025, 2026, and it's accelerating very fast. So Yang said, I got the idea, the trend line correct. I got the wrong part of the economy in terms of what was going to be the first one where you could actually see the difference in the job numbers and economic. So my point to all this is, if it's not truck drivers, if it's uh, if it's accountants and lawyers, those are the folks that are more likely to attend the political town hall meeting. They're the more likely to pay attention to who's running for governor or president or Congress. And I think we may find this bubble up as a political issue much faster than we even at this moment think it will. And we think it will. Like I'm saying, by this November, this may be something that a shocking number of people are describing as affecting their household, and certainly by 28. So it's good that you brought that up. And I think it rhymes in terms of the way it gets into the mainstream of media and the politicians. It's not when it hits people, it's when it hits certain kinds of people that are the
Yeah.
ones that are most likely to
Yeah.
understandably, bark up about it. So I just want to bring that up because I think AI is not coming up a lot as a near term political piece of dynamite. And I suspect it's about to explode.
I agree, and I think every serious politician needs to be talking about it. I started talking about it last time, and my campaign manager was like, "Dude, shut up about the robots." And I'm like, "Trust me, this is a thing. This matters. We should be talking about it because the societal implications and the timeline is tough. I mean, it could be 10 years, but let's say maybe even could be 20 until it's really displacing jobs. Still, that's, well within our lifetime and well within our children's, working lifetime. I was talking to a friend who teaches accounting at UNH, and he was saying that the last graduates of the accounting program, he said normally most of them are already like basically hired by accounting firms in New Hampshire the day they graduate. And this time it was about a third, you know? And and he was saying that one of the issues was that the jobs, the easy jobs that that you get right out of college were the ones that were the most, easiest ones for AI to do, stuff with spreadsheets and that kind of boring, but necessary work. And it was kind of something that he pointed out, which I thought was really interesting, is he was saying, like, you're always going to want a human to be double checking the numbers. You're never going to want to leave this up to robots completely or to AI completely. Um, and he was kind of pointing out how sometimes, the code that they would use that AI might make would be flawed, so we'd have to double check it and stuff like that. But he was saying, and I thought this was really interesting, one of the issues is the way you become a good accountant is by doing all these entry level jobs.
Absolutely.
And he was like, how does that work if it's harder for kids to work their way up from being, out of college to an advanced practitioner? And I think this applies to basically everything in the white collar world. Is how do you get an entry level position when those are being taken by AI?
Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist, podcaster, book writer, author, he a few weeks ago was interviewed in a podcast. I forget the title. It's an excellent podcast by a writer about how do people write. He talks to prominent writers about how they learn to write, how they use their brain to write. And he was describing a process where he's getting more and more pressure by his employer, the New York Times, to use automation, and for his staff, his researchers and all, to use automation to do a lot of the work. So, for example, they said, "Hey, Ezra, a way you could cut some of your workload is instead of sitting and actually reading the book of the author that you're about to interview, you could have a high quality AI summary done of it that could get you 80-90% of what you want in a matter of minutes rather than, days." And besides the skepticism about the knowledge itself, the double checking part you mentioned, he goes, "You want to know what has made me a better writer? It was writing a lot. It was reading." He goes, "The process of the reading, the actual is how I retain a high percentage of the information. It's the process of sorting in your brain the parts that are the aha moments from the parts that maybe you knew already. What parts are counterintuitive and that force you to read that page one more time. That's a process, and we got to be careful that we're not using the word efficiency as a synonym for process for learning. Like,
Yeah.
you're getting that result faster. And let's say the result's the same as what you would have gotten if you'd done it the old-fashioned way. But the like it is staring at spreadsheets for thousands of hours over the last 20 years of every precinct in New Hampshire's voting history. And that allows me to go to an event. I'm going to Moultonborough tonight and be able to talk without notes. They're like, how can you do all this stuff with no notes? And I'm like, it's because for 25 years, I've been at various points staring at partisan voter indices and PACO scores of Moultonborough, Tamworth, and Madison. That may be bizarre behavior, but it's what I like. So but if I didn't stare at it, I wouldn't know it. I think we got to be very careful about this.
Well, and I was talking to my partner about this last night and just saying, like, we might get to this point where we have certain industries and certain jobs that are, there's a requirement that there's a certain number of humans doing it. I mean, take surgery, for example. Do we want to be in a world where suddenly only the robots know how to perform surgery, which could be very problematic if there was a breakdown in the, power grid, or maybe someone hacked into the computer system and shut down the robots. You could see some sort of future where that happens. So we want this, this knowledge that, we've sort of all this accumulated knowledge of humanity that we're sort of at this point where we've got it. And, we don't want to give it all up to the robots. And I think that's going to take a conscious effort on our part to say, like, hey, I could use AI to do this thing, but I'm going to choose to do it the hard way, because I want to make sure I don't lose that muscle memory of how to use my brain.
The comedian Nate Bargatze, he recently, I saw a bit he did where he says, I got to tell you, there are times I feel really stupid. He goes, if I went in a time machine and went back like 120 years, and I got a feeling they wouldn't believe I came from the future, because I would say things like, yeah, we're going to have these phones one day that you're going to put in your pocket, and it's going to have all this, like the internet, and it's going to cameras and all that. And they'll be like, wow, how do you do that? And he'd be like, I don't know. I have no idea how that happens. Is that just satellites, I guess? And they're like, what's a satellite? He goes, I honestly don't really know. I just know it's important. So that's a comedic take at this sort of idea that the learning, we can't just get rid of it. That's the part that you'd like to think there's always a human element. I want to ask you, bringing it back to politics. So on my Substack at stevemarchand.com, every month or two, I do a little update on Governor Kelly Ayotte's net job approval rating. And ever since the beginning of these in February of last year, her first full month in office, I've compared it to the same point in the first term of every governor this century, because the UNH Survey Center, thankfully, has been doing the same question for over 25 years at basically the same points in
That's
every
great.
year.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I didn't know.
It's pretty awesome. And Ayotte, since the beginning, has had a net approval, job approval, positive versus negative, that has been far lower than any other governor this century at the same point. A couple weeks ago, UNH released their latest version of it, and it showed her at 47% job approval, 47% job disapproval, for a net of zero. That is 20 points lower than any other governor this century, including Craig Benson, who was defeated in his reelection attempt in 2004. He was at about plus 23 at this point. She's at plus zero. A question for you. I know most people aren't paying super close attention, certainly primaries or even Governor Ayotte on a day-to-day basis. Why do you think her job approval is so meh relative to Sununu, Hassan, Lynch, Benson, and even back in the 90s, Shaheen? We're going back at least 30 years to try to find anything like this. What do you think's going on there?
I think it's a couple things. I think she doesn't come off quite. I mean, just personality wise, she doesn't, I think, connect with people the same way that Sununu did, and the same way Maggie Hassan did. She seems just sometimes. I mean, even just sometimes admitting like, oh, I didn't know about this Merrimack facility, or I didn't know about this person that I'm, sponsoring, trying to promote to this position. I didn't know about their background. It just comes off sometimes she seems almost a little bit aloof. But I think the big thing that I learned from talking to Republicans who voted for her in my town is that they said they did not love her, but they did not like Joyce Craig at all. And it was basically like it wasn't a pro Kelly Ayotte vote as much as it was an anti Joyce Craig vote. And honestly, it just stemmed from this perception of Manchester. That was it. I mean, Joyce Craig was basically a mandate on her performance in Manchester. And the fact of the matter is, she never had the tools financially to do the things that I think Manchester needs because of our housing, or the housing, because of the property taxes, and it's the same sort of cycle. And I learned after the election, I thought this was quite interesting. I forget who I learned this from, but one of the problems is that Manchester was so successful with some of its homeless outreach programs that people were getting sort of thrown on buses and sent to Manchester. So it was like they were so good at, or they were getting good at, helping homeless folks. So other neighboring communities, even, I went down to Veterans Park and there was people there from Massachusetts and Vermont. And so I think that was kind of a failure of her campaign to articulate that they had done a lot of things for housing and for homelessness, but some of the zoning stuff just takes years to get pushed through. So I think that was really a big part of it. I've talked to a lot of Republicans who see Kelly Ayotte as still part of like the swamp, the lobbyist sort of, lawyer kind of, that whole world of just sort of money that's controlling. I've heard some conspiracy theories on the right saying that she's been brought in to sort of sweep the YDC lawsuits away, because she was attorney general during some of these accusations. And so I think they're deeply skeptical of her. I still think that it's going to be a tough row to hoe because of just the the incumbency bias is just so strong. It's so strong. I mean, the name recognition is such a hard thing to buy right now, particularly. I think we are in a very different media ecosphere than even 4 years ago, where I tell this story a lot to people, where the first time I was on WMUR last campaign, I was so excited. I'm like, we got to get on WMUR and this is never going to go anywhere. We get on WMUR. The next day, there's a group of 4 guys at a table in the restaurant. They're all at 21, 22. And I'm trying to sort of show off to them, like, hey, I was on TV last night. I was on WMUR. They're like, what's WMUR? We don't know what WMUR is. And then, and conversely, there'll be stuff happening maybe on, if you're on TikTok a lot, on New Hampshire TikTok, you might think, oh, this issue is a really big deal, and then you go and talk to a rank and file Democrat and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, you know? And so it's like everyone's getting their information from from different places. And a bunch of people are not getting any news at all. They've logged out of Facebook. They're not watching WMUR. There's not even, it used to be that if you walked into the bar next to my house, the Boston Globe would be there, the Portsmouth newsletter, the union leader. She bought all the papers for decades. And so there'd be a couple guys at the bar every morning reading the paper. You don't see papers sitting around anymore. People aren't even getting that sort of secondary news. And so it's just so hard. I mean, we're doing everything we can with social media because that is where people are. They're in their phones. But even that, I mean, you've got a world on Substack that is completely different than the TikTok, Instagram. So, I mean, the name recognition thing, I just can't even, I can't even say how hard that is to buy now, because just running WMUR ads is not going to do it, and trying to target this specific group of people being independent voters who are obviously not paying enough attention because they would probably have picked a team if they were. And where are they getting their news? Are they going to just pop up their head, 2 weeks before the election and go, how do I, which way am I going to vote? A lot of them are. So it's really, it's always going to be tough to beat an incumbent. I think that I've got the best chance because I think I'm offering the people of New Hampshire just a sound alternative. I think that one of the issues that the Democrats have right now that are elected is, they came out pretty hard against Andrew Volinsky's income tax, across the board. And I thought that was a mistake because, when you're negotiating, as we will be negotiating with the Republicans, you sort of want all the options on the table and say, okay, if you don't want an income tax, what's it going to be? You don't want a statewide property tax, what's it going to be? But if we take all the options off the table, if you take the pledge and you say, okay, no income tax, no sales tax, we've already tried the statewide property tax. I don't know how we could reform that to make it palatable. It just, where's the negotiation happening? And fundamentally, there has to be one party that wants to, challenge the status quo. And right now, the status quo is high property taxes. So to challenge that is to say, we need to raise taxes on somebody. And I'm saying business taxes, interest and dividends. And I think the Democrats that are elected right now really need to ask themselves, what is your plan to lower property taxes? What is your plan to fund schools? We've known this was coming since 2011. There's no world in which you can say this is a surprise. We've known about Claremont since 1993 or whatever. And more than anything, let's have the discussion.
Well, it's interesting, as you mentioned, how to get the word out, how to build the name ID. You've got these two different universes, right? This primary universe, which is a pretty definable group of people with a strong history of voting in Democratic state primaries. It's still a lot of people in a vacuum. It's not a lot of people relative to 1.3 plus million New Hampshire residents.
Yeah.
But it's depending how you calculate it, it's between 60 and 100,000 people who vote all the time or semi-frequently in Democratic state primaries. So it's pretty, I don't know if that sounds like a lot to viewers or not a lot. It's, 80,000 people is a lot of people, but they're determining who the nominee of the Democratic Party is. So it's not a lot. I mean, and you don't have to win all of them. you got to win half plus one of them. So all of
Yeah.
a sudden you realize that depending on turnout, 45,000 people may be determining who the nominee of the party is. That seems kind of manageable when you put it in that context. But they are dispersed in the state. And then you've got this, as you mentioned, these independents or undeclareds. One of the things we found in the research I do with the Substack, there is this cohort of voters that is unique. You don't really see this anywhere else in the country, that clearly are willing to vote Democrat for federal,
Yeah.
Congress, US Senate president, going back 15, 20 years. But there's between 8 and about 12% of them, of the population, who vote federal Democrat, but have been for the last decade voting Republican for governor, executive council, state Senate, state house. And in most of the country, there's only about a 1 or 2 point gap between federal voting behavior and state. And that makes sense, right? The brand should be the brand. But in New Hampshire, so spending time, where are these voters? Are they disproportionately in certain places? And it became pretty clear. I used to audit cities for a living, so kind of use those tools to build new tools. Is they're disproportionately in these suburbs. Think Hollis, Bedford, Goffstown, Stratham, Northampton, Greenland, the town of Merrimack, Brookline, very suburban profile. And they're 10 or 12% of the entire town. That's pretty clearly splitting. And it's very hard for Democrats to win state elections if you're getting, 57% for congressional, US Senate, or president in these towns. And then you're getting 45, 46% for governor, state Senate, state house. And this is where we have this kind of Jekyll and Hyde thing going on, right?
Yeah.
Democratic domination at the federal level in the last 10 plus years, Republican, maybe not quite domination, but pretty close over the last 10 years at the state level. So this cohort of people that are like suburban, high education, high income, disproportionately undeclared, splitting their vote. What's up with that in your opinion? How does a candidate connect with this group to bring them back into the fold? Because on the same ballot, they're
Yeah.
voting Democrat. It's not a different ballot. It's the same friggin' piece of paper.
Yeah. I'm just guessing. I wonder if that has to do with people moving up here from Massachusetts and considering themselves Democrat liberals, but they moved up here because they don't want to have an income tax, or they just see the Democrats as being the tax, party, which I think it would be a fair assessment, because I think we have to differentiate ourselves from Republicans in some way. Because I've been wondering a lot about this same issue, and I guess I didn't know that piece about them mainly being in that one area of the state, but I do wonder if that is maybe some impact on it. And I've been wondering about this group of people moving up here, or people that are, because there's some research by the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute that the folks moving here in the last couple of years were not primarily retired folks. It was people under the age of, I think, 45 was a dominant group. And I've talked to some people that have moved up here from Massachusetts specifically because they didn't want to pay the income tax anymore. But a lot of them had a lake house or something up here, so that they were used to being up here. So it was not like that weird of a transition. And maybe work went remote, so it was, something, they were able to get out of Mass for whatever reason. And I've kind of wondered if they after having been here for a couple of years, maybe moved up during COVID, are going to start saying to themselves, like, I wanted low taxes, but I don't know if I wanted like no taxes.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what, these folks, and they're paying property tax.
Right.
They're paying a lot more of it than they were probably used to. So they were focused perhaps on this is sweet, no income tax, no general sales tax. I'm paying $15,000 in property tax, or whatever the number is, depending on the kind of house they're in, what town they're in. And I do think that a lot of folks that move up here, of this cohort that right now, we call them older millennial, young Gen X, kind of in that 40s. And many of them, and I see them here where I live in Northampton, they like the local schools. And I think the Republican brand at the state level has become very anti-public school in every way. It's from the open enrollment to the voucher program, to the cap at the state level. You name it. They've been doing that, and the threat of reduction of services at the local level because of this immense reliance on local property taxes. If people are starting to connect that the current way of relying more on property taxes than any state in America to pay for schools, that's what we do. If this system is leading to degradation in the local schools, not only does that threaten your kids' education, now it threatens the value of the home that you probably bought high on if you bought it in the last 6 years, because people buy the homes based in part on the perceived quality of the school system in which the house is. And I mean, you get to a place where it's not stable, and instability is the enemy of planning, right? Like you don't know where this is going in 5 years. I think there's an opportunity here for Democrats to connect the dots, and you did it today. I've heard you do it on the stump of the property taxes and the housing and the schools as really one conversation looked at from three different angles. Getting people to look at it that way may be part of how we bring it back home at the state level, because they're already voting Democrat at the federal level. It
Yeah.
shouldn't be that wide a bridge, it doesn't seem to me.
No, I agree, and I think I always like to remind people, Bernie Sanders won 2 primaries here. Like, there's a bunch of progressive voters in New Hampshire. They are here, you know? I think, talking about the taxation issue, that's sort of why I didn't wanna go and commit to an income tax or sales tax, because I feel like there is this group of people that have been convinced by the Republicans that a tax on, millionaires will be a tax on someone working at, Walmart for $20 an hour. And they've been really fed this idea that, oh, well, they started with an income tax on millionaires and it slowly, lowered and lowered and lowered until it was getting me and you. So that's what we don't want that to happen. That's why in my approach has been, hey, let's go back to where we were in the year 2000, tax wise, and and have this debate, because I think people are ready to have the conversation. I think another important thing to bring up when messaging with rank and file Republicans is like, hey, the guys running Concord right now are not my grandfather's GOP. My grandfather was for low taxes, small government. These guys are for no taxes, no government. They're closer to political nihilists or anarchists or something. Like they don't want there to be a government. I think that's really important for people to understand. That's not even hyperbole. They don't
Right.
want there to be any taxation. They want somehow me and my business neighbors to fund the road, to fund the water system through some system that somehow has not been a government. Like the logic is it's just crazy.
Well, I mean, they're talking like cafeteria style governance. I would like this item and this item. And if I don't use the recycling every week, then I don't want to pay for the recycling. If my kids
Yeah.
are not in school, I shouldn't have to pay the education tax. If I work from home, should I really have to worry about the roads condition? And of course, we can take this all the way down. I mean, this can get pretty absurdist. And they want one tax, the property tax, and they realized how unpopular it is. So this is why they offered this cap on per pupil spending at the state level. I find it ironic that the rhetorically smallest government Republicans, often free state or libertarian, are the ones that were pushing the hardest and co-sponsoring the bill that would have said the state is going to tell you how much you're allowed to spend per pupil in your community. By the way, disproportionately using your local property taxes to pay for it. So they want you to pay for it. It's your kids in your town, and they're the ones that are going to tell you how much you could spend, but they won't give you the money to contribute towards it lower than any state in the country. There's an opportunity here, I think, for Democrats at the state level. But it's not easy. If it was easy, it would be already done. And so, anyway, so I see. Well, you know this better than anybody. You're the one running. So we're about an hour. Usually by now, people are done their lunch hour. They're heading back. Probably as good a time to end as ever. But shame on me if I do not allow for the shameless plug. How can people learn more about you, help you if they're interested, see you if and when you're out on in the wild?
I just put my website in the chat. It's votekiper.org, and you can buy my book anywhere good books are sold. Also at Community First Economics. And let's see, I'm going to be in Exeter. I'm going to be in Exeter tonight. If anyone's Exeter Dems out there, I'll be there giving my stump and answering some questions. And I really appreciate the conversation. I think it's really good to keep these talking points going, and give people things to go back and talk to their community about.
Well, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate it. As somebody who's run for office, I know how hard it is. I appreciate all that you're putting on the line here in your daily life to do this. It's a lot of work, and I appreciate it greatly. So thank you all for watching today. Appreciate all the viewers. You can go to stevemarchand.com. That's my Substack. Very pleased. It was ranked number 60 fastest growing U.S. political Substack in America last week. A lot of folks are joining, free subscribers, paid subscribers. My paid subscribers really help make it possible to carve out the time for all the research and data and so forth, the analysis that goes into it. It fills a niche in New Hampshire politics that in this devolving media landscape that I know Jon was describing, that makes it hard to get information. This is one way, a modest way to try to fill that gap. So you can find that at stevemarchand.com. This will be recorded. If you're not getting it live, and the majority of you probably won't be hearing this live, you can get it at my podcast, the Steve Marchand Podcast. You can get that on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We'll also have this up on my YouTube channel as a video version of a podcast. People seem to like that these days. And I would encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel and the podcast. Those are all, of course, free, and spread the gospel. Thanks again to my guest, Jon Kiper, candidate for governor in 2026. Thank you all for watching and listening. We will see you all again very soon.